Good evening. This work that we called closed classwork had its beginning in the unfoldment that was given to me at the very start of the work. I would like to explain to you that it is possible that everyone may not understand the reasons for all that takes place in our activity of the infinite way. Not that there are any secrets, but that you may not have been brought into contact with the work in a way to know all there is and the reasons for it. And I would like to explain to you that the entire activity of this work is carried on as it is given to me inwardly to do. I have never made rules or regulations about my work. I have never had rules or laws for our work or for the conduct of students. And the very few rules or regulations that have come through have been given to me, and always for a specific reason, and I merely carry them out. I'm not the author of them. I am only responsible for carrying them out, just as I'm responsible for my travels. Not in the sense that I want to travel, not in the sense that I want to give classes. If there is one thing I have never wanted to be in all of my life, that thing is a teacher. And if there's one thing I would like not to be now, it is a teacher. And if there's another thing that I could be granted, it would be permission to stop teaching. What I do under orders, not because it's my will or my wish. So it is that when class instruction began in the infinite way, we started from the beginning with the instruction that a closed class must be closed at the opening of the class, and no one to come into the class after the opening. At first, that was not as clear to me as it has since become, but I know now the reason for it is this. In our closed class work, we start from a premise. I never know what the subject of a class will be until we come to the class. Sometimes I know it in the morning before the class begins. Sometimes I don't know it until it actually starts. But it has always turned out that a theme or subject has developed with each class, and that we have gone from a premise to a conclusion. Also, that throughout the period of the class, consciousness has been molded. Now, in the beginning, when this classwork began, there were no Infinite Way students, so that every class was made up of Christian Scientists, Unity students, New Thought students, and occasionally someone from Orthodox teaching. Rarely that, but sometimes. And on the opening night of a class, You could almost feel the electricity in the air. It was as if the students were sitting out there and, in a way, holding up a mental wall and daring me to break through. Or perhaps it was that some of the Christian Scientists might have felt that I was going to begin any minute an attack on Mrs. Eddy, and the Unity students probably wondered when I would let loose on Unity or New Thought. And of course, by the second or third night, they discovered that wasn't going to happen, and we all settled down into a quiet and peaceful relationship. But it did take usually 3 nights before we settled down into a peaceful and spiritual atmosphere. Well, of course, in the years that have gone by since then, so many have been through class that the students coming into class now know that no one is going to be offended and no one is going to be insulted or talked about. And that as far as I am concerned, there exists the most harmonious relationship with the students and the movements in the metaphysical field. And for this reason, harmony is established immediately. So you will see, as the class goes on, the importance of being together here in one consciousness and keeping it that way throughout the class. I suppose that is the only regulation that has ever evolved regarding this work. Now, the subject that is given us for this class is spiritual healing, and spiritual healing from the standpoint of advanced work. In other words, it is not going to be confined to the basic principles, but is going on into another dimension. To clarify this, I would like to explain that spiritual healing takes place through a consciousness spiritually developed to some degree. The degree of spiritual awareness determines the degree of healing work of which one is capable. In other words, it is not possible for all students ever to be equal in healing capacity. There always will be some of greater capacity than others. There always will be some who can do some slight measure of healing work, and there will always be a rare one or two who will do really miracle works. Now, it isn't the teaching that determines that. It is the degree of consciousness attained by the student. I suppose it isn't any different than in any other art or profession. The rules of piano playing are probably the same for everybody, but all do not attain the same skill. Certain it is that in spiritual healing work you will find wide differences in the consciousness of different students. The first question that arises is it possible for all to attain the fullest measure of spiritual consciousness? And the answer is no, it isn't. The potential of everyone is the same. That is, basically, everyone has the Christ consciousness, the healing consciousness. But it is dormant in the human race, and it is aroused or awakened only from some inner urge. Now, what determines this cannot be stated as absolute truth, because there must at this time be a question. My own unfoldment says that since we have lived eternally, since we have always, since the beginning of God, lived as individual consciousness, that we have always been in an experience of individual life and individual form. Now, since the fall of man, since this sense of separation from our God consciousness, we have evolved. Some of us may have been slaves of Pharaoh, or in that particular state of consciousness, if not actually so existing in time and space, and others may have been Pharaoh, or that state of consciousness. Some may have been the men and women who were known as the wise men. Some may have been in life as the illiterates, the peasants who never rose above being peasants, or unskilled laborers, those who carried the stones that built the pyramids. But at any rate, we have been evolving through the centuries, and in any given century, we have been at a certain level of consciousness. Now then, if some have come into their present experience on earth with an evolved spiritual consciousness, it will be simpler for them to attain healing consciousness and a greater degree of it than those who have come into this experience not yet spiritually evolved. In the same way that we have the example of these children who at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age are doing concert work in music, or are wizards in mathematics. Certainly, it cannot be that a brain is a musician or a mathematician. Certain it is that a piece of physicality cannot think and dream music. And so it must be that consciousness has evolved in some of these people, so that as they come into this earth, they are evolved either mathematically or evolved musically or artistically. So it is others are evolved spiritually. Now, what determines the degree of our spiritual attainment is not whether or not we would like to be spiritually developed, but whether or not we have that within us which will drive us to it, that which will compel us to go through 40 years in the wilderness if necessary, that which will compel us to take the ridicule of friends or relatives or their displeasure. Those who find that they must conform to the human standards of their day, their community, or their family life certainly cannot hope to evolve too far, because the spiritually illumined eventually find that it is necessary to leave mother and brother and sister and father for my sake. And that doesn't really mean physically to abandon them, but it does mean coming to a place in consciousness where family or friends or supply or neighbors count for nothing and are not permitted to stand in the way of whatever it is that is necessary for our spiritual development. The human experience is one of limitation. The entire human experience is one of limitation, and the limitations are imposed not by you or me, but upon you or me. We, in our true being, we are unconditioned spirit, life, mind. In our true being, there is no limitation at all to our experience or to our expression of the qualities and of the quantities of the Godhead. But all of us have accepted limitations imposed upon us by racial beliefs, medical beliefs, nationalistic beliefs, religious beliefs, and whether or not we realize it, those limitations are upon us. All of human experience is limitation in one form or another. The entrance into the spiritual path is a breaking of those limitations. The action of truth upon our consciousness results in the breaking of these limitations. Physical, mental, moral, financial, in every way, limitations are broken by the activity of truth in our consciousness. And it is for this reason that those who find a teaching most nearly approximating truth can, of course, make the greatest headway in breaking limitation, and those who, with the principles of truth, work most diligently, most seriously, will likewise break these limitations to greater extent. Now, the limitations of our experience are imposed upon us not by anything that you do or not do, nor by anything that you think or don't think, but by universal belief, which acts upon us very much like Well, we could liken it to advertising. We see a certain ad enough times, and without even realizing that we're reading it, the first thing you know, we are buying that product. There was a play many, many years ago, It Pays to Advertise, which brought out that very point that men were wearing Boston garters, and every man had a pair of Boston garters. Why? Well, Boston was the one name identified with garters in every kind of advertising of the day. Magazine, newspaper, subways, buses, everything that carried advertising had that name, Boston garter. And really, as you began inquiring, you found that that was what was happening. So it was that in some cases monopolies appeared only because of that depth of advertising. Lately, another form of advertising has been revealed, subliminal advertising, in which you do not see the ad or hear it, and yet you're impelled to go out and buy its product. And you don't even know that you have been used. You don't even know that advertising was pumped into your mind while you couldn't see it or hear it, but you acted on it. Now, in that same way, our material beliefs have come down to us, not because we knowingly accepted them, not because we knowingly decided that we would be as we are, but because subliminally these things were introduced into our consciousness. In other words, things took place in our home, which as children we had no knowledge of seeing or hearing, and yet they registered in our consciousness. In school, we became aware of things that consciously we did not know were going on around us, and yet helped to form patterns within us. So it is that we are, as human beings, made up of, you might call it, prenatal influences that were forced upon us merely by the circumstances of the lives of parents or grandparents or neighbors, then by environment, that which we took upon ourselves from our homes and schools, then some of the things that have been taken upon us by virtue of our own experiences. You know, for instance, the type person who doesn't trust anyone. And when you find the reason, you find that at some period of their life they met up with 2, 3, 4, or 5 dishonest people, and it was at a time when they were receptive to such suggestions, and so became convinced that nobody can be trusted. And you know the other type of person who is trusting of everybody, even those who don't deserve it. And the reason is, likewise, that in their earlier experiences they were surrounded entirely by those who were honest, those who were sincere, and so they came to accept in their thought that everybody is God's perfect child. So it is then that our prenatal influence, our environmental influence, our own experience, all of these go to make up the forces that operate as limitation in our experience. To these there is another, and that is the universal belief of the ages. All of these things together make us the human being that we are. Now, the reason, and you must understand that it is necessary for you to know these things if you are to have the correct basis for spiritual healing. The reason that we have a world such as we have is due entirely to these universal beliefs which have created a materialistic state of consciousness. Let me show you how this operates. You have heard that the first law of nature, self-preservation. Self-preservation is the first law of nature. Now, as a matter of fact, this is only true in the experience of the most materialistic or carnally minded person, because the truth is that the very first law of God is, it is better to lose your life than to take another's. It is more noble to give your life to save another's. It is more noble to give than to receive. It is more noble to share than to keep. You see, there are two different planes of consciousness, and in this human materialistic consciousness, you have the reason for wars. Nobody could ever go to war if, or rather the world couldn't go to war if it was spiritually attuned, because war is a violation of the first law of God. Give your own life rather than take another. But the whole theory of war is shoot the other fellow first before he shoots you. Now, it is in the same way that we have such slogans as let the buyer beware. And remember that until the middle 1890s, that was the slogan upon which all business was transacted. Up to that time, there wasn't a store in the United States that had a price on its merchandise. Not a single store anywhere in this land. All merchandise was marked with a fictitious price, and then you bought it at the price that you were able to chisel down the salesperson. Never forget that. There was no such thing as a price, a fast price, and you bought at one price, your neighbor bought at another. Whoever was the sharpest trader bought at the lowest price. And it was only when John Wanamaker in Philadelphia decided that this was unfair, that there was no justice, that there was no Christianity in it, for he was above all things a most Christian man. And he determined that in his shop there would be one price for everyone. And this would be his idea of loving. This would be his idea of justice and fairness and equality. Well, he closed his store and had his clerks mark merchandise at the one price that it was to be sold for, the legitimate price. And of course the store felt that they would soon be out of work. And it very nearly came to pass, because the first day that he opened under that rule, many people came, but none stayed to buy. None of them believed that that was the price. They all tried to buy for less, and when they couldn't, they walked out, thinking, well, this is just a trick. We'll come back tomorrow and get it for our price. And it was the fourth day before that store began to do business. The store became a success, and because of that, our entire nation went on a one-price basis that has lasted in merchandising until just a few years ago, when these discount houses came back in again to break that old rule. But you see that buyer beware, or you can only buy at whatever price you're clever enough to get it. This is a materialistic concept of existence. It is not spiritual. It is not loving. It is not just. And therefore, you are only approaching the spiritual life when you have come away from such ideas as self-preservation, or let the buyer beware, and all of these other things that you know about. Now, the materialistic state of consciousness has been imposed upon us by universal belief. We didn't choose to be materialistic. It was, at birth, we could have been anything. But because we were born into a materialistic age, we took on the complexion of materialistic consciousness. Now, through spiritual studies, we are breaking through those limitations. Now let me show you again. All disease, all sin, all fear, and death itself, all of these are imposed upon us. None of these have rise in you. The failure in psychology and psychiatry, and perhaps some of you may have read in today's paper that psychiatry is now beginning to acknowledge that its entire basis is erroneous, and that it must look now for different principles through which to function. Of course, it has been a failure. Psychology has been a failure because the premise is wrong, and the reason that the New Thought movement, in all of its phases, has decreased to the extent that it has in the last 30 years is due to the fact that its basic premise is erroneous. Its basic premise is that the error, whatever its name or nature, has its rise in you. And therefore, we must find out what your particular error is and remove it. Now, this never was true. It isn't true now, and it never will be. All error has its basis in the universal belief, and this universal belief had its beginning in the acceptance of two powers. You are no more responsible for the particular ill that bothers you than Jesus Christ is responsible for it. You are as guiltless as He. You are as guiltless of the sin that besets you as any spiritual master. The fault is not yours. It does not have its rise in you. There is no such thing as you being unloving, or you being sensual, or you being unjust. There is no such thing. And every type of healing that is based on uncovering the error in the patient must fail. Some few temporary successes are due to reasons other than the use of such principles, just as many healings that take place in all of the metaphysical movements do not take place because of the principles through which the practitioner is working, but rather because of the consciousness of the practitioner, which is often far greater than the knowledge of principles. I can explain that this way. It would make no difference if you were studying principles that were not correct. There are in existence quite a few books on metaphysics that are as incorrect as 2 times 2 is 17. And yet there are people studying those and healing. They are doing the healing in spite of the error of their teaching. In other words, their own individual spiritual integrity is doing the healing work, not that mass of misinformation that they are absorbing. So it is that there are healers in every one of the metaphysical movements who are far greater than the teachings that they are following. And this must always be. It must always be, because healings are not brought about by the principles, but by the consciousness of the individual practitioner. Now, in every teaching there is truth, and enough truth so that the practitioner of spiritual integrity finds those gems of truth and with them develops spiritual consciousness. An illustration in point. There was a sailor back during the war who was on leave in New York, and suddenly, and out of a clear sky, became ill and felt that he couldn't make it back to his ship, and so he stopped into the nearest hotel, which was a very cheap place down near the wharfs, and got a room, went up to bed. But he was making no headway in getting out of this illness. He was a Christian Scientist. He telephoned downstairs to the clerk and asked if there were any books on Christian Science available. The clerk looked around and finally came back and said, yes, he found a Life of Mrs. Eddy. Well, the young man asked to have it sent up to him. And when it came up, it was one of those lives that vilify Mrs. Eddy. It was one of those vicious books that have been written that are filled with, you might call it, metaphysical pornography. And as this young man began to read, he discerned the nature of the book he was reading and thought, well, not going to be much healing in this book. And then he noticed that on almost every page there was a quotation from Mrs. Eddy's writings. And so, taking pencil and paper, he copied down the quotations and threw the rest of the book away, and by morning had healed himself and was able to get back to his ship. So there is nothing so evil in which some good cannot be found. And so it is, there is nothing so erroneous that there isn't enough good in it for those who are looking for good. And therefore, do not give all of the credit to our teachings for the spiritual advancement of individuals, remembering that the greater part of their development comes not from the teaching but from their own inner integrity, which somehow utilizes the teaching to its end. Now, to heal you must first of all understand where the sin, disease, lack, or death comes from that is to be healed. And the first rule of all is, don't look into your patient for it. Don't look into the mind or soul or body of your patient. You will not find it there. Your patient is just what you are, pure, spiritual, complete. The appearance does not testify to that. But then you are not to judge by appearances. You are to judge righteous judgment. And that righteous judgment reveals to you, this is indeed the child of God. Why? We all are. In our true spiritual identity, we are all children of God, regardless of the masks we wear. And at some part of our lives, we are apt to wear very ugly ones from the standpoint of either sin or disease or lack. But the point is that regardless of the mask we present at any given moment, behind that mask is our true identity. And our true identity is divine sonship. Now, when you recognize that, it is easy for you to take the next step and realize that this evil, whatever its name or nature, is impersonal. It is not of this person. It is not in or of them. It is an imposed condition, imposed by this universal belief of a selfhood apart from God, or a universal belief of a law apart from God, or a substance apart from God. You have very nearly healed your patient with your first realization of the impersonal nature of this sin, disease, whatever it may be. The moment that you have separated it from that person, you have started them on the way to their recovery, to their realization of their health. If you, by any chance, go back to looking for the error within them, be assured that you are helping to perpetuate it in them and for them. You are the blind leading the blind, and you both get into an awful lot of trouble. Far better is it not to attempt this work until you have come to the realization that all evil has its rise in an impersonal source. Now, it is all right if you merely call it an impersonal source, but if it helps to clarify it for you, you can call it mortal mind, or you can call it carnal mind, or you can call it an appearance or a suggestion, or you can call it a state of hypnotism or mesmerism. There are many names in metaphysics by which you can name this impersonal source of error, as long as you realize that it is not only impersonal but impotent. Now here is your second principle. I have known many to write me or call me and say, mortal mind is doing this to me, will you please do something about it? Now, this is all wrong. The moment you use the term mortal mind, you are supposed to know that you have just said this is non-existent, this is impotent, this is illusion, this is nothingness. Well, yes, I've even had people say, I've got a terrible illusion, won't you get rid of it for me? You see, healing work, spiritual healing work, actually comes down to impersonalizing and making impotent that which is claiming power. So that if you give it a name, don't afterward try to struggle with that name. Give it a name that means to you the arm of flesh or nothingness, an appearance, a suggestion, an illusion, something that when you name it that enables you to drop it and feel, the treatment is complete. In other words, the claim has found no reality in your consciousness. If the claim remains as something to be fought, something to be got rid of, something to be overcome or destroyed, you are not working with a spiritual healing message. Now, on the material level of life, you have two powers, and you use one to overcome another. On the mental level, you have two powers, and you use the power of thought or the power of right thinking to overcome the error, but not on the spiritual level. On the spiritual level, you are dealing with the truth that there is but one power. Therefore, you must come to the recognition that this that is presenting itself to you is neither presence nor power. That this that is presenting itself to you has no law, no substance, no activity, no reality, and therefore no battle is necessary. Stand ye still when you're in the spiritual world and watch the salvation of the Lord. Ye need not fight. Ye need not fight. Not on the spiritual level. The enemy is twice as strong as we are. But spiritual vision says they have only temporal power, the arm of flesh. We have the Lord God Almighty. Therefore, these great armies, no matter how big they are, have no might. The amount of them, the depth of them, the width of them, the breadth of them is nothing, because we have all might, that is, the one power, and regardless of the army of the aliens, regardless of the name or nature of the sin or the disease, ye need not fight. Stand still in the realization of God is infinite. Therefore, this that is appearing is nothing, is without law, without substance, without cause. And you will find that you have accomplished your healing work. It doesn't always follow that your realization will bring about an instantaneous healing, although you'll find that that will happen more often than you have ever believed possible. But there are other elements at work, which we will come to, which explain why all healings are not instantaneous. Now, before we go further into this, I would like you to see that every evil that has ever touched your life was preventable. It need not have happened, and that henceforth you can prevent 80 to 90% of all of the evils of the world from coming nigh your dwelling place. The only reason that I don't say you can entirely avoid them is that neither you nor I are in a position to place ourselves where we would be completely immune. In other words, with these principles that have revealed themselves to me in this work, it would be possible, if we would be willing to leave our families and go away and live by ourselves and just live within ourselves and abide by the principles as we know them, we could undoubtedly be 99% free of the evils of the world. That other 1% would plague us for a long time. In other words, death is the last enemy that will be overcome, and that will probably be among us for some time to come. But the mere fact that we cannot do that means that we are always making concessions to those about us. We are always making concession. We are always coming down to the human level because of those around us and with us who are not yet ready to live on our level, and we are not yet ready to abandon them. And therefore, these concessions make it impossible for us to be completely free of our discords. But you will find that you're free of the major discords and of nearly all. But this is the way in which it must be brought about. There would be no errors of any nature on earth but for the universal belief in two powers which acts hypnotically in our consciousness. And therefore, when there is the rumor of epidemic in the air, even though we don't hear it, even though we've turned off radio and television and stopped the newspapers, and so we have no knowledge that an epidemic is in the neighborhood, it manages to convey itself to us without our conscious knowledge. And then we say, this came upon me out of the blue. Or, I wasn't thinking this, and yet it happened. I wasn't thinking about this, and it happened. True, because evil of any and every nature operates invisibly as a belief in two powers, and because this is a universal belief, it acts universally in human consciousness, and to the degree that we do not consciously reject it, we become victims of it. Therefore, it is necessary that we start every day with a form of, well, we can call it a mental practice, realization. In the writings we have called it protective work. Now, protective work is probably the most important part of all of the work in the infinite way. The reason is that if you sufficiently protect yourself, you will have that much less need of treatment or the overcoming of anything, because you will avoid those things that ordinarily we have to overcome. Now, protective work is not a protection from anything or from anybody. It isn't a protective work in that sense. It is protective work in the sense of protecting ourselves from the operation of universal belief. I will give you as reference the chapter Protective Work in the Infinite Way Letters, 1955, and the Across the Desk in the letter of June 1960. These two papers cover the subject of protective work, and even though I give it to you here, and even though you may again hear it on tape, please believe me that this is not sufficient. You will need constant reminders of it for at least a year, daily reminders of it, until it has become so deeply rooted and grounded in you to do this protective work that it becomes automatic and done without conscious thinking. Now here it is. Whatever sins or diseases or lacks or limitations or storms or wars or infections or contagions that are to take place throughout this day are actually the operation of universal belief. Call it the carnal mind, the veil of illusion. Since this universal belief of a selfhood apart from God, or a power apart from God, is not God ordained, this belief has no person in whom, on whom, or through whom to operate. And it has no power, and it has no law. As a matter of fact, it isn't an it. It is an appearance. It is an illusion. It is merely a belief that derives its seeming power by acceptance, and I hereby reject it. I consciously reject the belief that there is any power but that of God, Spirit. I consciously reject the belief that there is a material or mental law with power, since God is Spirit and God is the only law and lawgiver. Therefore all law must be spiritual. Now you see, since everything that operates has to operate with law, you have nullified everything but the spiritual law of God, the law of good, the law of harmony, the law of justice, equity, equality, the law of peace, the law of dominion. But choose ye this day whom you will serve. Choose when you awaken in the morning whether you are going to allow yourself to serve the universal belief in two powers, or whether you are going to be God-governed. Now, you can only be God-governed by an act of your own consciousness, because without this, You, just like every human being in the world, are subject unto the powers that be, the so-called powers of mortal mind or carnal mind. You must come out and be separate. You must bring yourself out from under the universal belief in two powers and establish yourself in the grace of God and realize there are no powers to operate in, on, or through me or anyone except God's grace. For I and the Father are one.